Blood Boxing, coming at you once again with another video. Dre for Thought wanted my opinion on the James Toney versus Bernard Hopkins fight that never happened. And who do I think would win if the fight did happen, okay? Look, I'm not sure if you wanted to ask me this question, but we're going to look at it very good. Now, I think that their best chance to meet would have been at middleweight. Number one, Bernard Hopkins is 3 years older than James Toney, okay? James Toney came into the division earlier than Bernard Hopkins, okay? Now, after Marvin Hagler retired and Sugar Ray Leonard decided not to test the waters at middleweight, which I don't blame him because he would have got his ass tore up. Because when Marvin Hagler left the division, there was a lot of talent. There was like a new school of middleweight contenders. You still had Roberto Duran hanging around. He'd get a belt from Barkley. Thomas Hearns, I believe he moved up in 1989. Was that 89 when he fought Kenshin for that WBO strap? That belt that they just made up all of a sudden? Anyways, Hearns moved out of the division, okay? So you had guys like Frank Tate, Michael Nunn was coming up. Mike McCallum was moving up. You had Kalambe. You had Michael Olajide, Iran Barkley, Julian Jackson. Over in England, you also had Michael Watson and Harold Graham. So there was a lot of competition out there, man. The waters was deep, okay? Michael Nunn seemed to be at the top of that list, especially after what he did to Frank Tate. If anybody wants to see somebody get embarrassed, go look at the Michael Nunn versus Frank Tate fight. And Frank Tate, an Olympian, an all-around school boxer, but just couldn't deal with Michael Nunn. Michael Nunn was doing his thing in the division, okay? He fought a couple of smaller guys, but the Kalambe knockout was what separated him. He knocked this guy smack out. Nobody had ever did that to Kalambe before, and it never happened again. So that group of guys was very popular. The Julian Jacksons, the Mike McCallums, the Michael Nunns. There was talent there, okay? In the early 90s, there seemed to be yet another wave of fighters come in. You had like some of these guys, well shit, all of them started in the 80s, but they became relevant around the early 90s. You had like Reggie Johnson, Gerald McClellan, Lamar Kid Fire Parks, Roy Jones, Nigel Benn, Chris Eubank, Steve Collins. So all of these guys came around in the early 90s. Then somewhere around the mid 90s, after Roy Jones left the division, you had Bernard Hopkins. You had guys like John David Jackson, Quincy Taylor, Keith Holmes, Lonnie Bradley, Antoine Eccles, Robert Allen, Julio Cesar Green. You remember those names in the 90s. Bernard Hopkins separated himself from that bunch of guys, which to me wasn't a very talented group of guys compared to the previous wave of fighters that came into the middleweight division, okay? Most of those guys had moved up to super middleweight, or either they were no longer fighting, like Gerald McClellan. We know what happened to him, but the talent that was present when Bernard Hopkins was the man, I don't think the talent pool was as rich during that time period as it was just a few years before that. James Toney and Bernard Hopkins, they just missed each other. Now let's get back into that in a minute, okay? Let's talk the styles. As a middleweight, James Toney, he was aggressive. He would stalk his opponents. He was great at catching the punches, utilizing a very effective shoulder roll, very quick reflexes, and could counter with the best of them. We all know about James Toney's chin. He had a hard chin. Yeah, I know he was floored by Reggie Johnson, and it's not like he's never been down before, but he was never really hurt really bad in there, okay? He was tough, man. I saw him getting outboxed by Michael Nunn. Even though he was having his moments, I thought Michael Nunn, if he could have just held on, I think he could have won that fight. Before the Michael Nunn fight, James Toney, the only name he really had on his resume is Murky Sosa. He fought a young, undefeated Murky Sosa who was, a decent fighter. not one of the all-time greats or anything like that, but a decent, solid fighter who'll give you a test, okay? And anybody who knows about Murky Sosa, he'll give you a test. I know he didn't look great against Roy Jones, but, you know, who was that? The Charles Williams fights were great. You know, he showed that he's an aggressive fighter that could bring the fight to you. And James Toney made it past that. They were both undefeated, okay? Other than that, before Michael Nunn, shit ain't nothing on his resume. After he beat Nunn, he had a real struggle against this guy, Dave Tiberia, a guy who never fought again after he fought James Toney, but he actually gave James Toney some fits at times, you know, and this is a guy that's not even a known fighter. So, you know, all fighters have fighters who present that to them anyways. Glenn Wolfe was another guy that went the distance with James Toney. And I think in his very next fight, it just took Roy Jones one round to get rid of him or something. James Toney had some controversial fights with Mike McCallum. All right? Now, at this same time, Bernard Hopkins was already in the middleweight division. In fact, James Toney left the division in August of 1992. I just did the research. At that same time, in August of 1992, James Toney had just turned 24 years old. That same month, he turned 24. Bernard Hopkins was running around 27 years old, 20 fights deep. So the fight could have happened because in less than a year, just 9 months later, Bernard Hopkins fought Roy Jones for his first world title shot, okay? And just a couple of months after James Toney vacated, Bernard Hopkins started his impressive USBA run on USA Tuesday Night Fights. Anybody who was around in the 90s, who was a serious fight fan, know all about USA Tuesday Night Fights. And that's where Bernard Hopkins made his name at. That's where I remembered him from. I remembered his impressive run on USA Tuesday Night Fights because he had the weirdest entrance I ever saw. That stuck out. And of course, his boxing skills stuck out. And he became one of my favorites. That's why when it was time for him to fight Trinidad, and I was winning money because nobody really knew who he was unless they was watching Tuesday Night Fights, because Bernard Hopkins wasn't getting no big fights on HBO or none of that. He was a TV fighter. He was very active on TV too. Very active. So I bet everything that he was going to beat Trinidad. Other people didn't know what Trinidad was getting into, but I knew at the time. Now, if they had met in 1992, because that was the best chance for them to meet, that was the time when they were in the same division. One was 24 and one was 27, all right? I don't think that Hopkins was quite ready for James Toney at the time. Not in 1992. Both of them were similar fighters in some respects. They both have, okay, I'll put it this way. They both had the same kind of attributes. They were different fighters, but they had the same kind of attributes, okay? Both were much more aggressive fighters when they were younger. Both of them were more aggressive when they were younger, okay? Both of them were very textbook fighters, man. In fact, James Toney, he studied a lot of the fighters such as Ezzard Charles and even mentioned the great Barbados Joe Walcott. There is a video on YouTube. I don't feel like looking for it and pulling it, but there is a video on YouTube where they're showing James Toney at a young age now, during the time he was a middleweight, where he's looking at fight footage of older fighters and he's respecting the craft. Bernard Hopkins, you'll see him utilize a whole bunch of different skills, okay? Bernard Hopkins, just extremely athletic, caught on very fast. He could do some of everything. He utilizes that shoulder roll. You could see him in the peekaboo style, an ambush fighter from time to time. When he was younger, I don't think he was quite as complete of a fighter as he would be later during the decade, okay? He became more complete later, all right? James Toney was at the height of his skill set already, all right, in 92. Now, he went in there with Mike McCallum. If you don't know about Mike McCallum, you got a lot to do, okay? the body snatcher. So I think if they had met in 92, and that's the best chance that these two could have met, I give the fight to James Toney, point blank. I don't think it's fair on James Toney to place a Bernard Hopkins who's more closer to his peak, and I believe Bernard Hopkins' peak is mid to late 90s. That's just my opinion. I believe that he peaked mid to late 90s, all right? That version of Hopkins might provide a better fight. It could go either way. If they was fighting in the 50s, they would have fought 4 times, and I could see them splitting the series, honestly. These fighters have some of the same attributes. Both of them have hard chins. In their prime, they had the reflexes, they had the skill sets, they could do some of everything. Unfortunately, they were not built the same. James Toney was headed out of the division. He grew out of the division. I don't think he ate his way out of the division or nothing like that. He grew out of the division naturally. You could kind of see it in like James Toney's neck and stuff. If you look at his neck and his shoulders, you could kind of see that he was going to end up being a bigger guy. It was kind of obvious. He just has that kind of frame to where he was going to end up being a bigger guy. So if Hopkins would have fought James Toney later in the 90s, he would have been fighting a much bigger guy than him, because James Toney actually outgrew Hopkins. Then there came a time where James Toney stopped really putting in the work in the gym. I don't know what happened, but, you know, he started to come real pudgy to the fights, man. You know, that started way back in super middleweight, man. You know, he was having problems making the middleweight division. I'm not really sure 100% how dedicated Toney was to his craft. He always seems to be around gyms and stuff like that, so I think he was pretty dedicated, even though I heard at times he would lose focus and things like that, where we know Bernard Hopkins lives a very strict life. So the fight could not have happened later in the 90s, because James Toney at that point had really outgrew the division. It would have been one hell of a promotion, though. It would have been a great promotion. I think James Toney has the edge in the promotional type stuff. I mean, not being a promoter. I'm talking about just shit talk, trash talk. I would give James Toney the edge in that. James Toney did indeed fight the more skilled fighters. He fought Mike McCallum. He fought Michael Nunn as a middleweight, all right? Bernard Hopkins met Roy Jones as a middleweight. Even though James Toney would meet Roy Jones later, it would be as a super middleweight, all right? Anyways, man, I know I probably went a little long in this video, but I just wanted to explain my stance to you, man. Me personally, I believe that their best chance to meet was in 1992. In August of 92, James Toney left the division, okay? Bernard Hopkins was already over 20 fights, all right? So it's not, you know, unreasonable to say that they could not have fought. You know, if James Toney could have stuck around for maybe another year, that fight could have perhaps happened. But unfortunately, Bernard Hopkins was not willing to move out of the middleweight division at that time. And Bernard Hopkins was, you know, his body was different. You know, James Toney, like I said, you know, he had the kind of body to move up. You know, Bernard Hopkins seems to have a real fast metabolism, even as an old man. You know, he has a fast metabolism, just a different type of body altogether, man. You know, a lean type of guy. So it's just a fight that wasn't meant to happen, I would suppose. I would favor James Toney to win the fight in 92. I'm out of here.
Every sport from me, you know, you get to hit people all the time and don't get in trouble for it and get paid for it on top of that.
On the other hand, James Toney says he was born angry at the father who wasn't there. He often got into fights and dabbled briefly in drug dealing. But don't let him fool you. There is a soft side to James Toney.
Where? Don't tell nobody out there. Because then they might start believing it, and then I might lose my credibility a little bit.
Nah, you're finished. They call you old school, you more like old fool. You see how you ran around the ring with your head down, headbutting everybody. That's not boxing. It's called clownery, sissiness, bitch assness. If you want to fight, Bernard, I got time for you.